Is a direct meeting between Ukrainians and Russians in Moscow actually possible? That's the question for this evening, of course, but I'll tell you right away that the likelihood of such a meeting is practically zero. And there are objective reasons for this, reasons the Russians themselves have created. First and foremost, yes, Ukrainians on the territory of the Russian Federation are a huge problem right now, especially the delegates from the negotiation group, and particularly some individuals whose names, well, it's just hard to imagine how they would immerse themselves in the legal field of the Russian Federation. In any status, where did this information come from? It came from a Telegram channel called Ukraine Context. So today it published this kind of information stating that in order to speed up the options for the negotiation process, the possibility is being considered for the Ukrainian delegation to travel to Moscow for negotiations in person with Putin. The reason is that although the current composition of the Russian negotiating team is more constructive than the previous one, they still have no influence in the Russian Federation and no authority to make the relevant decisions. Because of this, the negotiations are essentially at a standstill. Therefore, as these contributors to the Telegram channel write, at the latest negotiations, the phrase was voiced that there is no point in endlessly traveling to the United Arab Emirates or the United States, and that meetings should take place where real decisions about how everything will move forward are actually made. Witkoff and Kushner are offering to act as security guarantors. Their plane is supposed to arrive in Warsaw, where it will pick up our negotiators and then fly to Vnukovo. After that, both delegations will hold direct talks with Putin, but despite that, the participation of Kyrylo Budanov in all of this remains in question, as the Russian Federation had already arrested him in absentia back in 2023 on trumped-up charges. Well, fine, they ended that post with Budanov. Let's figure out what happened with us. In 2023, the investigative committee of the Russian Federation charged the then head of Ukrainian intelligence, Kyrylo Budanov, with terrorism in absentia. In addition, at that time, charges were also brought against the then commander of the Air Force, Oleshchuk, and the commander of the 383rd Separate Regiment of Unmanned Aerial Vehicles, Bereza. 3 people were accused of terrorism in one fell swoop. Can you imagine the head of the negotiation group, Kyrylo Budanov, who, with a terrorism charge, arrives on Kushner's plane at Vnukovo Airport? Are you kidding? Secondly, Vnukovo Airport. This isn't the United States Embassy, meaning it's not the sovereign territory of another country. The United States Embassy is a place where you can stay and where Russian jurisdiction does not apply. How could it be there? Just like that, with the snap of your fingers to get there or to teleport, there could be different options. If you end up on the embassy grounds, then you really can guarantee a certain level of safety for all our negotiators. On the territory of the Russian Federation, but if you are on the sovereign territory of the United States, which is protected by laws, diplomacy, and everything else, Vnukovo is not such a territory. So let's not build castles in the air here and talk about someone already flying somewhere from Vnukovo. Even in March 2022, people didn't fly out of Vnukovo. They drove by car to Belarus. And somewhere in Minsk, they would meet up, or they chose other locations. If someone finds it too far to fly to the United Arab Emirates, then please, Istanbul and Ankara welcome everyone. Go ahead, you can do it there. Orban offered Budapest. That's a rather questionable option too, but why not? I think anyone could provide such a venue today. Today, this venue is the Middle East because there are both American and Russian interests there. And in principle, the territory is neutral and the crown princes, the Saudis, help everyone. That's why it's hardly even theoretically possible to discuss all this. Bereza reacted to this story that I just read, and 3 marks. Question marks. Why did several sources confirm to me that this was discussed on Bankova? That is Borislav Bereza, who, according to my information, is currently abroad. He follows the political process and in fact has very good and popular communication channels. Now he is claiming to all of Ukraine that his sources are reliable. As I understand it, otherwise he wouldn't have mentioned it, he claims that the possibility of a meeting is being worked out. I've just explained to you why this is impossible. Now he's explaining why this might be possible. We're trying to present an objective picture. 2 exclamation marks. The Ukrainian delegation might fly to Moscow to meet with Putin. That's one of the options. An acceleration of the negotiation process. So immediately an acceleration of the negotiation process. Ukraine has no interest in speeding it up as much as possible because, according to the logic of the official position of the president's office and official Kyiv, speeding up the process is capitulation terms that are being imposed on Ukraine, meaning any acceleration involves terms that could lead to capitulation. So here we also need definitions. It's important to use the term capitulation correctly. Of course, there will be no capitulation because the word itself carries a different meaning, a completely different connotation. And if you want to put a political spin on it, let it be called capitulation. Well, no, it's not capitulation. These are simply unfavorable terms. So acceleration equals unfavorable terms. Furthermore, various international news outlets are currently reporting that Boris Witkoff and Jared Kushner may potentially be appointed to act as official security guarantors in this matter. However, many experts argue that these are simply not the right individuals who possess the necessary qualifications to act as security guarantors, but as several reliable sources continue to report from behind the scenes. Mr. Bereza, so is their plane supposed to fly to Warsaw to pick up the Ukrainian negotiators and bring them to Moscow, where the parties will hold direct talks with Putin? This is basically a reprint of the Ukrainian context. It is separately noted that the participation of Kyrylo Budanov remains in question. And then an interesting question arises in the context of Budanov. Yermak will be returned as the head of the delegation to Chukov. Here, it's kind of an emotional story and irony. Why is that? Because Yermak won't be returned to Yermak. Right now, there is no one to talk to in Moscow because Dmitry Kozak is gone. Kozak's replacement. In fact, it seems to me, not least because there is a lot of pressure on the president's office, and that's all well and good. But Yermak, who used to have a direct phone line to the Kremlin and spoke with Dmitry Kozak there, at a certain point when Kozak was gone, Yermak's role was significantly reduced. And probably at the strong request of Washington, this is just an assumption, they asked to replace this person as well. And also the political climate and the situation in Ukraine. It so happened that this moment came and was accelerated for certain purely internal Ukrainian reasons. And Yermak stopped being the head of the office. So, of course, Yermak, even in the scenario of flying somewhere to Vnukovo in Moscow, it definitely won't be Yermak. Because they'd have to bring Kazak back, and Kazak is written off there for good. Serhiy Kirienko, by the way. So, of course, no, nothing like that will happen. Now, regarding what is being written again, this Ukrainian context, that someone is tired of flying to the United Arab Emirates or to the United States of America. The next round of peace talks will take place in the United States of America, just like that, if the Russians agree. This was stated by the president of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky, literally just a few hours ago. On the agenda is the US proposal to create a free economic zone as a buffer. In Eastern Donetsk region, neither side is interested in the idea of a free economic zone. Neither the Russians nor we. Our views on this are different. In the discussion about who will control this buffer zone, the US needs to clarify its position. If this is our territory and it is our territory, then the country to which this territory belongs should govern it. The Trump administration wants to sign all the documents at once. Ukraine will need to approve the peace agreement or either through a parliamentary vote or a national referendum. Recent negotiations in the UAE have focused on mechanisms for a ceasefire and on how the US will oversee it. However, the negotiators were unable to finalize the details without political decisions. The highest level. Any truce will require monitoring by the US. The Russians have one wording, we have another, and the Americans have a third. There is an understanding that monitoring will take place, but there is also an understanding that additional steps are needed. Work, wording, and details. This is a summary of the news about possible negotiations as early as next week in the US. And, there's another unexpected story like this one. The Financial Times, by the way, wrote about the elections, which supposedly, that is, in Ukraine, in the president's office, they're preparing for referendums, for elections, and for everything under the sun. And all of this is being tied to some elusive date, May 15th. And moving on, we won't talk about the elections. I made a separate review about that. Here, specifically about May 15th, the Financial Times writes that Trump's team wants not only the elections to be held, but also the implementation of the entire package of peace agreements, including the withdrawal of the armed forces of Ukraine from Donbass by May 15th. And the only thing that could hinder all of this is, in fact, the position of the Russian Federation itself, whether it will be possible to reach an agreement with them within such a 3-month time frame or not. According to the Financial Times, this acceleration is happening due to the upcoming midterm elections in the US. Therefore, Washington is leaving Kyiv, and I quote, very little room to maneuver in the context of the upcoming midterm elections. The plan may be postponed depending on how far apart they are from each other, Kyiv and Moscow, on the key issue of territories. Well, the landing of the plane at Vnukovo, it's unlikely that this story will speed things up, and there's also a very strange interview with Lavrov. He said that he hadn't seen. Will he accept these 20 specific points of the peace plan? Not once in his entire life, even though these points were originally drafted and authored by the Russian Federation itself.
The long-standing idealistic vision that security can be guaranteed and sustained, heavily depending upon the solemn promises and assurances of those who currently rule the world, of those people who preceded them. There were serious leaders in the West as well, but even they didn't manage to fulfill the commitments they had made, so to speak. They didn't manage to give real substance to their own signatures on a whole series of documents. That's why security for us is something non-negotiable, just as non-negotiable as something that might seem so close to the West, like human rights. And here the total ban on the Russian language in all spheres of life, the ban on the Ukrainian Orthodox canonical church, all of this remains with the West. In Europe at least, and in Britain, of course, it's completely outside the scope of their thinking about how to move toward peace. The Trump administration made an attempt in those documents that, in the last quarter of last year, after the meeting in Alaska, circulated in various versions. We saw only one, which, well, more precisely, the Americans officially gave us their document. Thank you. All subsequent versions are the result of attempts to distort the American initiative by Zelensky and, above all, his patrons from Britain, Germany, France, and the Baltic states. Of course, they also want to have their say somewhere, and in the American proposals, it was stated that rights must be restored for Russian speakers and Russians. Well, as a national minority, that's what it's called, even though, in reality, the term national minority doesn't really fit when applied to Russians in Ukraine.
In short, when Medinsky was gone, Lavrov took Medinsky's place in the negotiation group. Historical digressions, this is what Russians do best. I'll finish this review with another quote from the Financial Times. Ukrainian and Western officials also believe that the US imposed timeline and ultimatum are unlikely to be met, since all of this depends on the possibility of making progress in the negotiations. It is with this specific group of individuals, people like Vladimir Putin, Sergei Lavrov, and their entire political company. And what we are witnessing happening right now is, in fact, a completely orchestrated and theatrical farce. You can attempt to negotiate any specific deadlines or timelines that you want, but the reality is that not a single one of them will ever be practically workable or feasible in the real world.